So today's session is titled Understanding Microaggressions and Other Isms Towards Women of Color in the Workplace. And so we are going to have some, I'm going to share some information and I'm going to try to leave about 10 minutes at the end for some questions. The first thing, as part of the Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Social Justice, we are changing some of the ways in which we engage in this work. And one of the ways in which we have made some adjustments is to do land acknowledgements. And folks probably are familiar with these, maybe some folks aren't. But there are a lot of national higher education conferences that this is a standard practice as a way to acknowledge and recognize our history, and to acknowledge folks who have been marginalized in really painful ways. Really quickly, related to our mission of creating equitable and just environments through advocacy and social and racial justice education, the Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Social Justice would like to acknowledge that the land we occupy as an office and as an institution is the original homeland of the Osage, Cherokee, Shawnee, Adena, and Hopewell tribal nations. And so let's go ahead and get centered in this conversation. And so why now? Why is this conversation so important during these times? And there's a host of reasons for that. One of the obvious reasons is our current racial climate that I would argue has always been here, and that we've always had these sorts of issues, but they are just so much more prominent that they're inescapable now. And so, of course, that is a perfect reason to have this sort of conversation. But I also think in terms of when we think about the way this institution has engaged in and has committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And so part of that work is really helping build the capacity of our community to understand the nuances and the impact that race and identity and marginalization and oppression have on people. Another reason why this is incredibly important, I'm not sure if anybody saw this, but I was really struck by this. So the American Medical Association has come out and clearly named racism as a public health threat. And what we know about health outcomes based on marginalized identity, especially those marginalized by race and ethnicity, there's a huge amount of disparity in health outcomes, in access to healthcare, in access to all things health related. There's a huge amount of inequity there, which leads to a host of other things. And so for the American Medical Association to acknowledge that this is a public health threat should be a wake-up call to all of us. All of us deserve and depend on good health, as good a health as we can have. And so it's critical that as a society, we continue to move forward and really recognizing and unpacking what racism really is and the ways in which that it is impactful. Quickly, I want to just go super quick over these two slides. I think it is really, really important for folks to get comfortable with shared language. And so there are going to be some terms and some things that I'm going to be talking about that may be familiar to some people, but not everyone. And so we're going to be talking about things around identity. We're going to be talking to things around privilege. We're going to be talking about things around intent and impact. We're going to be talking about biases. We're going to be talking about allies and accomplices. We're going to be talking about microaggressions. And so I encourage folks to, as you are engaging in this work, however that looks for you, for folks who do engage in this work and for folks who want to continue to increase their capacity, a beautiful way of doing that and getting on that journey is really understanding the language of the movement now. And really taking that in and really processing that and starting to move using that kind of language. One of the biggest things that I think is important for this particular conversation for all of us to be very clear on is what exactly intersectionality means. And I have heard intersectionality presented in a host of different ways. a lot of times the way I've heard it positioned and heard it described was, well, you know, we all are a host of identities, and so that makes us intersectional, and these identities intersect. To an extent that is sort of right, but this is really the purpose of intersectionality. And so this term is actually is a framework that was designed and coined by legal and critical race scholar Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a Black woman. And she developed this framework as a method to explain the unique experiences of Black women in the workplace. And essentially, this is a not even a long bullet point, but this is sort of the crux of what she came up with. And so when you think about workplace dynamics and you think about all of the messages that we are told about, if you feel you're being treated differently, if you feel you're being harassed, if you feel like someone is targeting you for your race or some sort of identity, and in particular marginalized identity, there are policies in place that are supposed to be designed to protect people from that. And so when you take a look at racial discrimination policies, what entities can say and often have said and continue to say is, well, we can't, this isn't an issue around race because we have Black or Indigenous men of color. And so this issue that you're having, Black women, this issue that you're having, Latinx woman, this issue that you're having, a multiracial woman, this isn't rooted in race because we have all of these other, um, you know, men of color in this space. So we can't be a racist institution. And so then you turn to gender, and then organizations will often say, and then can still say today, well, we have female employees, so we can't be sexist, or we can't be anti-woman, or we can't be only centered on men. And so that leaves out the experiences of Black women and Indigenous women and women of color in the workplace. We experience the multiplicity of oppression. And so it's important for people to really understand what that term really is for, and the roots of that term and why that term exists. It really, really is a way to explain the experiences, particularly of Black women, but also of women of color in the workplace, and not just the workplace, but in other aspects of their life. And so I'm a young social worker. I was working in the child welfare system, and I was working in a unit that provided training across the state for child welfare workers. And so it was myself, the head of our department, who was a white man, and then another trainer who had been there much longer than me, who was a Black woman. And so we're talking about doing this training video. And so the white guy gets super excited and he turns to me and says, so Carol, you can play the ghetto girl in this training video. And so when I think about it now, I recognize why I didn't say anything, because I didn't know that I had the license to say anything. Two, I didn't know what to say. And what happened was the Black woman real quickly fell right in line and said, actually, no, she won't. And then things got weird, and then the meeting adjourned, and all of that stuff kind of happened. But it's those kinds of things, these small, casual, verbal, and behavioral indignities against people of color. That was the original definition of a microaggression in the 70s. And as we move through time and people learn and understand more, then the definition shifted to these brief everyday exchanges that send messages to people of color, that because they belong to a particular racialized minority group or racialized marginalized group. Subtle statements and behaviors that unconsciously communicate denigrating messages to people of color. Microaggressions are often unintentional, but they can also be intentional. And it really can be applied to any socially marginalized group. Even though it was originally to describe the experiences of people of color, what we know is that if you hold a marginalized identity, if you hold an invisible disability, and you hear things that people say, if you don't identify as Christian, maybe you identify as atheist. Like, there are so many of these microaggressions that people are exposed to. And again, 9 times out of 10, the intention is not to cause harm. But what we have to be mindful of is the impact. and words can cause harm. And microaggressions over time really do have a very negative impact on the psychological safety, or how you feel about yourself in an environment. Yeah. Oh yes, yes. I see your comment there, Alexis. Yeah, people assuming that you can answer all of the questions. Those things over time and in their totality, it may seem like a very small sort of engagement, and some small sort of moment, but we're talking about over time, and these things happen every day, every single day, in a host of different ways. So there is no real relief from it. And so what's important to understand about microaggressions is that it is connected to racial trauma. And it's critical in this particular time, given all of the things that we have been seeing around racial justice issues, around racial unrest. It is critical that we also understand the impact of that. And racial trauma is an absolute real thing. And it is essentially the cumulative effect of racism on someone's mental health and their physical health. And it includes direct acts of racism, such as hate crimes or being discriminated against at work. It also is a systemic racism, that kind of exposure. It is also, it leads to health disparities. It leads to pay inequity. It leads to a host of things, and one of which, microaggressions, contributes to that racial trauma, because those are those repeated injuries over and over again. And so a lot of the work that I have been doing over the last probably 5 or 6 years in my role on campus, I spend a lot of time talking to folks who have been impacted by some sort of instance of whether it is racism, whether it is something that is targeting their ethnicity, if it is targeting their size, if a host of things. And what I can tell you is that over this summer during this pandemic, also at the same time where we also had so much racial unrest that is still unresolved, the folks that I saw the most over the summer were women of color. And every single woman of color that I talked to, absolutely what they were describing was racial trauma. And it shows up in really, really obvious ways, but we often don't have language for that. And so I think back to my own experiences as a Black woman living in America, and the ways in which I can look back now and identify different parts of my life where my own racial trauma was front and center. And I did not have the language for that at the time, which is why it is so critical that we're able to give people language to name what it is that they're experiencing. And so for Black, Indigenous, and women of color in this space, if you have felt like a little bit off, a little more hypervigilant, tired, more irritable, more likely to withdraw, what you're likely to be experiencing is racial trauma. It is a real thing, and it is important that we name that so that people know, like, you're not losing your mind. What you are experiencing is real. Dr. Candace Nicole Hargans actually works here. She's on faculty with the College of Education in the Counseling Psych Department. And so we, as an institution, are so lucky that she is here. She was recently voted onto the board of the American I think it's the Psychology Association. This is a real thing. It is 100% a real thing. And so we have a, I want to, I see the comment, and I will just ask for that person when we have time for questions that we revisit that, because I think you're going to give us a really good perspective as someone who's coming from outside of America. And so I think it's also important, because we are talking about how people are experiencing things in the workplace. What does the research really tell us about allies in the workplace? And this is so striking for me because of an experience that I had. I was working in an office Myself and another a white woman have just started. We shared an office, and the first thing that she did was she hung up a rainbow flag that said ally on it. And I was like, oh, well, that's interesting. And she began to tell me of all the ways that she identifies as an ally to LGBTQ folks, not knowing that I identified as a queer woman of color. And so just naming yourself as an ally, I think lots of people do that. I'm not necessarily sure that people necessarily understand how that shows up in the workplace. And so there was some research that was recently done that found out that 82% of white men and 81% of white women see themselves as allies to colleagues of color at work. And it also showed that the majority of white people in the survey identified their own strongest allies as an equal mix of races and genders. When Black women and Latina women or Latinx women were asked the question, just 10% of Black women and 19% of Latinx women said most of their strongest allies at work are white. Only 45% of Black women and 55% of Latinas or Latinx folks said they had strong allies at work. And so the ways in which allies think that they are operating and the ways in which allies perceive themselves and that identity is different than the ways in which they are impacting the experiences and the environment of the people that they claim to be allies to. And so I want to walk through this for a couple of minutes, because I think it is really, really important, again, as this workshop is really centered on what happens in the workplace. It's critical to recognize the ways in which Black, Indigenous, and women of color often experience workplaces. And so I don't know if folks are familiar with this particular image, but I saw that and was like, oh my goodness. And I could pinpoint my own experiences in environments that I wound up disconnecting from. And so the way that this starts out is the woman of color enters the organization, and they enter the organization because leadership is in a place of, we need to be more intentional in our diversity efforts. We're not reaching enough diverse whoever. We're not serving enough in certain marginalized community here. And so the recognition to do better and to reach more is exactly what we need. And so I appreciate that, and that is necessary. But there are some things that follow after that make these situations different than what people intended them to be. And so the woman of color comes to the organization, and there's that honeymoon phase. And like, there's flowers, there's welcome signs, there's cupcakes, people are going to lunch. Folks might, get together for the occasional outside of work hours socialization. It feels good. The woman of color feels wanted. They feel safe. They feel like this is a really, really good fit. Then reality starts to sort of set in. And the woman of color names, a way to show our work is becoming more inclusive would be for all of us to share data around the most vulnerable communities, for all of us to share data broken down by race. And the response often can be, well, we're going to just give you all that work. That's what we brought you in for anyway. And that, I didn't get told these exact words, but that was the sentiment. And what I was told was, well, like, that's your job. And so I thought that's what you were doing. The problem with that is that it absolves everyone else from doing any part of this work. And then it leans heavily and solely on the woman of color in that space. So once we go back real quick, so once there's the response, the environment starts to change. And the woman of color may or may not feel as welcome and as part of the team as she did when she first got there. The excitement of having a woman of color in the office has worn off. And so what often happens is there's tension that builds up. And then there's a situation where the woman of color is targeted or experiences this sort of an attack. She's being a bully. She makes me uncomfortable. I'm not sure she should work here. That is such loaded language especially when it is used as a way to describe the presence of a woman of color, a Black woman in particular. And having had an experience where some of these things were said about me in an environment, it was devastating. It was 100% devastating, and it is not healthy when these kinds of things happen. And so next thing you know, the woman of color is targeted, and then there's some retaliation. And so there's some sort of HR process, or there's the social exclusion from the rest of the team. And so no more lunch invites for you. No more, let's go out for, you want to grab coffee? There's no more of that. When you walk into a space where everyone else is present and they stop talking, just simply because you're there, you walk out of the space and you hear them talking in. And so that is like, it feels retaliatory for just naming what it is that our entire office or our department needs to really be doing. And so what eventually happens is that that Black or Indigenous or woman of color leaves the organization with additional racial trauma. She's carrying enough as it is simply by her sheer existence. And so to go to work and have to work in an environment where as soon as you walk in, people stop talking. An environment where you used to be included in things and now you're excluded from everything. It creates such a psychological burden for folks. And then what it really does for the organization becomes unsafe for Black, Indigenous, and women of color. The organization continues to be estranged from these communities, and there is an absolute impact on the institutional reputation. And so it is important that people recognize this and know that this is a real thing. Some folks experience this on a regular basis. So if you're the only woman of color, if you're the only Black woman in a space, you may experience this far more frequently than you're even comfortable, naming for yourself. But what I want to say to folks is that you are not imagining things. This is not made up. These things are real. The way you feel about it, the way that it is impacting you is 100% real, true, and legit. And so it is important to name that and to say that because this is exactly the experience that so many women of color across a host of racial and ethnic identities experience in the workplace. This is real. It happens every day. And so one of the things that I think is really important is to really help folks understand the difference between an ally and an accomplice. Because in the situation that I just described, allies aren't necessarily the most helpful, but accomplices could be. And so the difference between an ally and an accomplice is this. An ally is a person who's a member of an advantaged social group who takes some sort of stand against oppression. And let me just name that takes a stand is actually ableist language. But it is an indication of how these kinds of things are just slide into everything. So I just want to name that this particular definition has some ableist language in it. It is a person who works to eliminate oppressive attitudes and beliefs in themselves and their communities, and they work to understand and interrogate their own privilege. And so allyship is great. Being an ally is an important identity. It's an important identity for lots of people. And there's a space in this movement and in this work and in liberation for the presence of allies. But when we take a look at what an accomplice is, an accomplice is a person who is focused on dismantling oppressive structures and systems at the direction of the marginalized group or individual. And to do so requires that that person engages in behavior that puts them at risk. And so allies are great. Accomplices, for me, in my identity as a queer woman of color who sits at that intersection and who experiences the multiplicity of racism, sexism, homophobia, patriarchy, misogyny, like a laundry list of things. What is most helpful for me is an accomplice. But I recognize that to be an accomplice means you have to be willing to engage in risk. And not everybody has the ability to engage in risk. And so there's no judgment at all. If an accomplice identity is not something that someone feels like is going to work for them, it's not for everybody. It's not. But for the folks that do feel like they want to do more, I really, really encourage folks to explore and understand more about what accomplice behavior is, because it is a game changer in a lot of ways. And in the workplace, it could really be the thing that completely changes an entire environment. I see a question. Oh no, I see a question here. I don't know, Pamela, if I would say that you do one before the other. The question was, do you become an ally before an accomplice? I don't know that there's a step. I think people do what is most comfortable for them, and that's what I encourage people to start with. Start with what you feel the most comfortable with, and if you feel like you have the capacity to do more and you want to do more, then do that. But do not feel bad if you're not at a point where you want to engage in that risk. Risk is real, you all. Like as women and as folks who identify as women, we understand this very, very well, how risky it is for us to use our voices to speak truth to power. And so there's no judgment at all, about how someone identifies. I think the biggest thing here is do your best not to cause harm. I think that's a level, that's where we can all start from. And so the last few slides really are about individual kinds of work, things that you can do for yourself. And so for Black, Indigenous, and women of color in this space, I want to name clearly that it is okay not to be okay. We are expected to carry and hold all of this stuff inside, and we cannot. And if you identify as Black, what we know about the burden that is put on Black women is in some ways crippling, but it is necessary. And so it is okay not to be okay. There is no shame in naming that. You cannot help anybody else navigate anything if you can't pull yourself out of the muck. And so it is okay not to be okay. I would encourage folks to cultivate a group of folks in your life that no matter what goes on, you could call at a moment's notice. And you don't have to explain yourself, and that you just call, you can vent. Find that group of people. I myself am incredibly lucky that I have a whole committee of folks. There's about, I don't know, 17, 18 of us. And at a moment, we don't see each other all the time. Well, clearly not now. But even before, we didn't see each other all the time. We didn't talk every day. But let me tell you, somebody put a call out for something and we will all show up. No questions asked. And so that is my safest place as a Black woman, is in community with those folks. Now, some folks may be able to negotiate this. That is up to other folks. I have been very, very fortunate that I have worked in environments where my supervisors understood more about racial trauma and understood why I needed to call in Black. And it was on those days where maybe there was another shooting, maybe there were 2 shootings, and all of that stuff is just splayed all over the place. And I just was so covered in racial trauma that I could not function. And so I have called in Black. Now, I don't encourage, like, you have to figure out whether or not that's the language that you can use. But if for folks who are supervisors and for folks who are in positions who can make those kinds of decisions, I really, really encourage you to be as empathetic about the impact of racial trauma that it's having on your staff. Please, 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 please believe them when they tell you what is going on. Please believe them when they tell you that they are struggling, because that is the God's honest truth. The other thing, of course, exercising, healthy eating, be sure to get enough sleep. Disconnecting from social media and not watching those videos. And I hope folks understand what I mean by those videos. I have not watched a police involved shooting of a Black or brown body in years. I can't even remember the last one that I watched. If you've seen one, you've essentially seen them all. And there's no need to incur and ingest any more trauma than already. And so I encourage folks, disconnect from social media and do not watch those videos. Those videos are not going to help you at all. Now, for folks who identify as white or who may be identified as white, I understand and recognize the necessity of sharing that information as a way to enlighten other folks. I would just ask that if you post those, that if you could just sort of, give some content warnings, maybe not have it pop up as soon as, somebody shows, somebody clicks on something. Like, there's ways to be able to protect that. And still be able to share that information. I would just ask that folks be very, very sensitive to the impact that those images have on Black, Indigenous, and people of color. The other thing to do is connect with providers that can help you navigate your trauma. One of the things that we offer in our office is I still continue to do the confidential advocacy and support for any person who's had some sort of experience around their identity that just makes them feel like this isn't safe or something. And so I extend that invitation to everybody in this space right now. I am not a mental health professional. That is not what I do. What I do is validate people's experiences and help them navigate through those moments. And again, folks can reach out at any particular time to set up an appointment for that. And so here's what support can look like. Ask people about their experiences and believe what people tell you. I cannot stress enough the importance and the impact of hearing someone say, I'm so sorry you had this experience and I believe you. That is what we encourage folks to say when someone has been assaulted, whether it's a sexual assault, dating violence, or anything else. I encourage folks to have that same position. You do not have to experience it. You do not have to navigate it. And you don't lose anything by telling somebody that you believe what they're experiencing. You don't lose anything. In fact, you gain a lot. Please keep please center the person who's been the most impacted. Make the commitment to educate yourself on the impact of marginalization on students, staff, and faculty, but even just people in general. It is really, really important to continue to increase your capacity to understand these sorts of things. And that really involves you doing your own work and being mindful of what is happening in marginalized communities that may impact the people around you. Please do not make the lone person of color in your office your diversity person. I worked in an office very early in my career, and there were two older white ladies who always came to me with their Black people questions. And again, at that age, I did not understand the impact of that. But now, I'm pretty certain no one's going to come knocking on my door asking me about some Black people stuff. I don't know. They might try it. I would hope they would not. But please do not lay that burden at the feet of the most marginalized and minoritized folks in your work environments. And this one here is so critical. Continue to engage in intentional dialogues about the impact of racism, sexism, and all the other isms. But please do that when those members of those groups are not in the room. And so if there's a group of all white folks in a room, there's nothing to prevent you all from talking about racism just because a Black or brown person isn't in that space. There's conversations that need to be had regardless of who's there. And so challenge yourselves to really, really engage in those kinds of conversations when folks are not present. And the last few slides are really things about how you all can take action. And so I'm pretty sure that you all are going to get a copy of this. And so I really encourage folks to really focus in on this particular slide, to think about what was the most significant piece of information that you got from this session. What are your own personal goals, or do you have any personal goals or aspirations in relation to this sort of work? What are your professional aspirations? Do you have any of those? Think about, maybe there's some terms that we talked about today that you have a deeper interest in. But there are a host of ways that folks can engage in the work and engage in self-work in very, 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 very specific sorts of ways. And so I will leave everyone with this last question before we have some time to ask. I have some time for questions. Really, really think about this. Who or what suffers in your own personal or professional environment in relation to equity, inclusion, and or social justice if you do not follow through on the goals that you name for yourself? Who or what suffers if you don't follow through?